when you factor in the number of international students who will have had a whole variety of different experiences before they come, and mature students, I don't think it's really true that that old traditional A-level is what everyone came with is actually true anymore. So I think it puts you in a different landscape anyway.
Hello and welcome to the Test Community Network. My name's Tim Burnett. I hope you're safe and well. This is a special for the next 3 weeks. We have a new mini-series focused on higher education and digital assessment. We've got 3 fantastic sessions coming up for you. Today we're going to start off with Lesley O'Keeffe, and she's talking about student welfare and digital assessment and her experiences as a registrar at Brunel. And then later on we've got Birmingham City University talking about their experiences with hybrid assessment, and then we have Lisa from Teamco who's going to be sharing her experiences setting up on a journey really of setting up large-scale digital assessment deliveries in kind of big halls and using technology. And she did that as part of her university career, and then she migrated over to Teamco to help them with their work, rolling that out to other institutions. So really 3 really excellent sessions coming up for you. As ever, anything you see, you can go to the Community.Network. You'll find more information on there. We have the subscription option, which you get a lovely weekly email through from me, jam-packed full of things you may have missed in your profiles and media, and things that I picked up from elsewhere as well. So there's the marketplace, there's podcasts, and there's the events that are coming up as well. I'm going to give you some highlights of those. Don't forget, you've got the Superpowers webinar as well for research. That looks at deep research and the tools there, so it's really worth checking those out. If you've not used any of the deep research tools, you should do. They're absolutely incredible, particularly if you're on the Plus plan for OpenAI. It's quite an incredible experience. And there's also the leadership webinar that I did with Amanda, Liberty, and Lesley, just negotiating the hype and fear of AI and getting yourself ready for the conference season and really getting ready to ask those really tough questions of the platforms that are available out there. Just having a quick look at what's available on the market. So we've got Credible, we've got a webinar on the 13th. You might just catch that today. You've got the 19th, you've got the e-assessment, education assessment research group. It's actually a research group, but that's Mary Richardson and the team. They've got a great session coming up. Got Grade, I've got a webinar coming up. That's looking at written assessments if you're interested in marking and written using AI to mark things. We've got Educationscape, AI tools for assessment event coming up. Inspira, I've got a webinar coming up as well. What do educators and students want from AI? We've got the EBMA annual conference. I believe that's going to be a hybrid, so you could watch it always virtual, actually, looking at that. And then in the podcast space, Clear, we've got another podcast out looking at emerging issues from Clear's committee, so regulatory environmental scam. We have the evidence-based education podcast, Elements of Great Teaching. That's a great one to look at. And then Beyond Technology, Education 4.0, AI Innovation, and the Future of Learning at Queen University's Belfast. And then just a couple more. We've got Rory does a great podcast. In this case, he's got IB on there, and they're talking about women in leadership in the testing profession. That's really worth listening. Anything with IB on, that's definitely worth looking at. And then we've got the place for micro-credentials in New Zealand. That's from Stuart Martin. That's a new article that's in the marketplace. Stuart was a guest on the show last year sometime. Worth checking out. I think it was early kind of July time. And then how wearable technology can compromise exam integrity. So there's an article there from the E-Assessment Association. And then we have the course presentations again for the E-Assessment conference. So that's taking place in June. Brilliant conference to go to. I'll be there. We've got the interactive space, we've got the main presentation space, and there's lots of other syndication rooms. And plus this year we have, like last year, the AI symposium session on the first day. So it's a 3-day event this year as opposed to what used to be a 2-day event. So let's get on with my conversation with Lesley. Here's me in conversation with Lesley.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you're well.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Well, we're going to talk here about kind of universities and I suppose your experiences in examinations and welfare. Before we do that, do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit more about who you are and what you've done and do?
Sure, thank you. I'm Lesley O'Keeffe, and up until December just gone, I was actually the registrar at Brunel University London, and I worked there for over 16 years in a variety of roles, and ended up in the role of registrar for since COVID, actually. But I have given up my permanent role and I've just entered into an interim and contractor freelance space. So at the moment, I do have an interim position as interim registrar at SOAS in London, but looking to shake it up a little bit throughout my career and help universities tackle a variety of different things through the academic registry and student services space, help with interims as they're appointing, trying to appoint perm positions, and just see how I can use some of my experience in a variety of different institutions.
Excellent, excellent. And just what's involved in the registrar role then? What does that kind of cover?
Well, every university has it slightly differently, actually. So it's quite an interesting question. At Brunel, I had responsibilities for academic services, which there meant quality assurance, timetabling and examinations, awarding and graduation, and the student record system. I had responsibility for student services, which was all of the welfare, counselling, disability support. It was the non-academic front-facing provision and the chaplaincy. I also had responsibility for the library, for apprenticeships. I was the designated safeguarding lead, and I was also secretary to Senate. And I always think I've maybe forgotten something. So at Brunel, it was a really quite broad remit. However, in the new position that I'm doing in an interim just now, it's a much smaller role. So although it has the same job title, it's slightly different. And in my current role, it's taken much more focus on the academic services side rather than all of the other add-on pastoral things that I just listed off in my previous role.
It's quite a lot then, isn't it? It's it can be. Do other people, I know you say it kind of varies from university to university, but can it be as involved in other universities? Is it even more involved in other universities?
I think it's just different. I think the role for me at Brunel was made up based off the experience and that I could bring. So often they are given to people and then the roles are molded around them. So if they've got particular skills, they might say, oh, can you just take on this department? And actually we're going to take this department and put it somewhere else. Because in universities, things are forever moving around. So I think often you'll find that you've got remits which are around the skills of the individual. And then when that individual leaves, then each university then goes, well, now what should we do? What opportunities have we got now? How can we splice it up? What is the best combination to work with? So I'm sure Brunel's going to go through that shortly now that I've left that gap.
And so examinations was part of your kind of role, that was, I suppose, end of course examinations, summative examinations, not in course kind of examinations. Is that correct? It's kind of the
so broadly, speaking over you, broadly the examinations team would set the timetable for the exam seasons, which were at Brunel. We had winter exams after the first semester, then there was May exams after the second semester or end of year, and then there was resit exams in the summer. But they did, and that was their main focus really, was set in the main large exam venues. But they did do a little bit of in-class testing. So some courses that would have examinations just in the lecture as they were going or something outside of that. But they didn't really get involved with things which might be tests in the lab or any kind of more hands-on. That wasn't part of their team.
Okay. And I suppose, is that common then for examinations to be under the kind of registrar role elsewhere? Or does that again vary from institution to institution?
I think it's fairly common because when you think of the size of institutions, so Brunel was around 16,000 students, you can imagine the operational undertaking of having those mass exam venues. So generally it was done by a central department because you have to think of the scheduling to get all of the different exams and the best use of the space. So you might have a hall that can take 1,000 students, for example, but which papers do you want to have that day to make sure you're using as many of those seats as you can? It can only really be done centrally because otherwise everyone would only be looking at their own little thing. But there's so much operations outside of the kind of when and what time, because we need to get extra toilets in. You need to get extra. At Brunel, the vast majority of the exams, I think it was about 90% in the end, were digital exams. So actually you needed power, you needed Wi-Fi infrastructure around all of that. You had to kind of set the exams up. There was just so much other stuff that had to be thought about. I think that generally is done as a central thing because of the scale of the operation.
Yeah. Okay. And what was unique, particularly about the way that you ran exams? Was there anything different that you particularly do?
So at Brunel, they
institution?
used a bring your own device scheme,
Right.
which was basically the students had to bring their own laptop to facilitate the digital exams. So that meant we didn't have to set up banks and banks of computers to do that digital exams. And they used some software which would lock down the internet browsers for them to take the exam for that period of time. It worked quite well because it cut out, like I say, a lot of the operation we had to think about. But as with anything, it brings about different challenges. So what about the student who turns up and their laptop broke this morning, or they dropped it as they were coming from the bus to the site, or they just haven't really thought about it and they just rock up, or they don't own a laptop because they can't afford one or whatever. So then you have to think of all of the things to help and support students deal with all of those kind of variety of issues that can happen.
Yeah, and was that kind of like a trend? So you talked about the vast majority of the exams were digital. Has that always been the case? Has that changed COVID? Did that COVID, was that the tipping point for it, or was it, how's the kind of trend developed in that space?
So this was actually a conscious decision for Brunel. So I don't know when it started because I wasn't in post then, but I think it was around 2016, 2017. There was a conscious decision to go towards digital exams. And even before COVID, around 25 or 30% of them were digital exams. So it meant that we were in a really good position to be able to respond when the lockdowns happened. Obviously, it meant we had to deliver them differently because they were at home and not in an exam venue, not invigilated, and they were generally open book 24-hour exams, which was what was generally done in COVID. But we already had the infrastructure for much of what was needed. There was a desire at Brunel to increase the percentage of digital exams, and COVID just helped that. So after COVID, we basically went from whatever I just said, 25 to 30% before, to then almost 90%. And that's really when we noticed those kind of other challenges, like when you've only got a percentage of your exams on digital and somebody forgets a laptop, you've probably got enough spare in the cupboard that you can pull one out. But when you've got hundreds and hundreds of students coming each exam time, then it's a bit harder to have spares for everyone.
Yeah. And what was the kind of students' view on using digital assessment? Did they enjoy it? Did they like it? Did they value it, or did they just not really think about it?
I don't recall really any mass comments or concerns about it because it's just what Brunel has been doing for so long. So it's just there. I think if I was part of trying to get a university to embed this and start again, I'm wondering if maybe queries might come up, because people don't like the change, do they? But if they go into a university and that's just what it's like, then they don't know any different. But if they were to go in and do, their first and second year maybe on paper, and then all of a sudden they're expected to have a laptop and the software and be organized, then I would imagine that there might be more issues. But I don't know if has COVID maybe helped with that a little bit. I think students are expecting to do much more online and in a digital world.
I think I think they are when it comes to learning-based activity, but for the vast majority of them, if they're taking A-levels as their kind of entry route into university kind of environment, a lot of that's still paper-based. I just wonder if there is. I know they're kind of used to using the computers and laptops for their own learning activities. I just wonder if if it's a shock to the system to then have to take the examination on computer. Do you think, or do you think?
Well, lots of students aren't A-levels anymore. I think that's particularly at an institution like Brunel. There's a large percentage which have come through BTEC route, so probably not even used to exams anyway. Then you've got, when you factor in the number of international students who will have had a whole variety of different experiences before they come, and mature students, I don't think it's really true that old traditional A-level is what everyone came with is actually true anymore. So I think it puts you in a different landscape anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's not the same. We're not talking about the same thing really, aren't we, anymore? And I suppose that in terms of the infrastructure challenges and the bring your own device and stuff like that, were any kind of noticeable examples of where you think you've got it right or you got it wrong in terms of setup and procedure? I'll tell you one quick one. I've always heard about an examination that takes place in Canada, a big examination, and they're very strict on what the students can wear, as well as when it comes to bringing their own device, because I suppose there's more of an opportunity for cheating practice to go on to the point where they cut off some chap's hood on his hoodie because he didn't have anything else to wear. It was quite kind of strict. But I suppose, do does bring your own device kind of add any kind of security complexities or any other additional challenges to the exam process?
So there's a clear desk policy with the exams, as you would imagine, in the same way that you would with any paper exams. The main challenges have been maybe around some of the digital security. So there was one exam period, this has been resolved now, where the university had just launched the multi-factor authentication. So our students had, maybe got their laptop ready or maybe not, had put their phones, which we instruct them to turn off and leave at the back of the exam hall, sit at their desk, and then it's asking them for multi-factor authentication, but their phones are in their bag. So there was an awful lot of like back and forth to get that set up. So that was switched off fairly quickly after the first exam day when they realized that this was not going to work very well. So I think there's sometimes we go so far in our digital security that it kind of went against the grain of what we were trying to do in the exam, and that was such a stressful day for all the invigilators. The other thing that we've had is our digital software that we were using had pushed through an update on their software the weekend before our exam season started. So when the students came and opened their computers, then they wanted to update. So, there's things that are maybe outside of your control, or you just haven't really thought about the timeline of them, which wouldn't have ever been a problem if it was paper and pen, of course. So things have cropped up, and I think that's just people as an institution taking a while to realize that this is now a big thing in the digital space, and you have to really be conscious of the Wi-Fi load, which was another thing. We had to put extra routers in there because I'm guilty of this, I don't know about you, Tim, but if I'm somewhere and they say turn your phone off, actually all I do is to turn on to silent. I don't actually turn it off. While they're on, they're still drawing on the Wi-Fi, aren't they? So although we're saying turn them off, so then we have to change the announcement saying please actually turn it off because it's draining the Wi-Fi. But like when you've got hundreds of students in a venue, are they all going to actually turn their phones off rather than cheat the system like we would?
Yeah, it's following the instructions, isn't it, as well? What's been the driver then for moving to digital? Who's been driving this? Has it been one kind of committee, one team, one person? Is it just the natural? It was
one team, yeah. It was one team originally, actually. It was our Pro-Vice-Chancellor Education, who's no longer in post, actually left a couple of years ago. But the momentum has maintained. I think people have seen that this is a good thing to do. What's been really interesting is that people have really got behind it, actually. So the software enables you to set up assessments in a whole different number of ways. And some of our academic colleagues have got quite savvy with the software and got it to do quite fancy things. And this is another conflict that we've had, that some of the things that they then think as part of the assessment, they're asking students to go onto a particular website and generate something to use it for it. But then we're like, but in the exam situation, of course, we lock the websites down. So then they're like, well, we want you to override that. And then we're like, well, we can, but you're overriding that for every question, not just for this question. So it's really understanding how the software works. And it's okay to have the internet enabled if that is not going to destroy the integrity of the exam, obviously. So people have really got behind it and have tried to find interesting ways to do assessments for students because, everybody knows now just doing essay question answers is not what we need to do. We need to be doing different things. Chat GPT, whatever, can generate an essay for you quite quickly. So you need to find different, more interesting ways to do the assessments. It's fascinating to see it evolve.
It is. Just on the GPT side of things, we're talking now about O3 having kind of super PhD level capabilities in terms of problem solving and stuff like that. I think it's going to really going to throw the kind of higher education process into question if that's all that students are churning out, and it's quite hard to detect and identify with these things. But yeah, it's fascinating. But I suppose one area, because I know you've got a bit of a specialism in kind of welfare side of things. What's your kind of take on the emerging trends of student welfare when it comes to examinations and academic study? What's been happening in that space?
I think probably I would chat to you about two different things. So firstly, if we've just been talking about actual assessments and exams and turning up for them. I think that everyone who's involved in that now has to just be tuned in to the amount of anxiety and stress that causes individuals at that moment in time, and how to deal with that. It's not uncommon for us to have students whose level of stress and anxiety is such that, you know, they can't even go in the exam hall, or they need quite a lot of one-to-one to kind of get them to calm down to do that. And I think historically our invigilators wouldn't necessarily have thought about that. They would have just thought, oh, that student's, you know, a bit stressed, and like shrugged it off. Whereas now they realise that actually part of their role is to try and calm them down enough to hopefully try and get them to sit the assessment, because missing an assessment can have kind of really quite big impact on a student in higher ed, you know, can delay their progression, all the things you probably know about. So I think that's something that's really important, and people have had to respond to for actual exams, turning up for them. But I think more broadly, the thing that we were working on quite a lot at Brunel, and I'm sure that other universities are, is kind of the growth in individuals that need specific adaptations for their exams for them. So we would have called that student with additional needs. People will have different terminologies they use. And I'm not sure if you're aware that there's been some case law coming out of the University of Bristol with the Aberhart case. And through that case law, there's a higher expectation on universities to identify and respond when they think a student might have a long-term health condition or disability. So historically, universities generally would have only taken action when there was a formal diagnosis of a condition, whereas now this new case law will say that if you've got enough evidence that you believe that that individual has the condition, then you should take the action even without a formal diagnosis. And that really comes into this space where you're talking about exams. So we're not talking about somebody who is stressed just because they've got an exam. That is kind of stress for a particular situation. This is somebody who might have a long-term mental health condition that is really affecting their day-to-day life, and therefore an exam or assessment is just another part of that, which might be causing them a peak challenge for them. So that might be, for exams, it might be a lot of students who might need small rooms or individual rooms, depending on what might be going on. At Brunel, we had individual rooms for 4 and rooms for 8. But if the number of people that need those increases, then actually you've got to find the space to be able to invigilate those exams. You've got to find the invigilators. It means your footprint across the campus of running the exams is going to be larger, because you're going to be much more spread out instead of the big traditional spaces. But it's what those students need in order to get them through. So the university is obligated and should be doing that from a moral point of view to support them through it. So I think there's a lot of challenges coming up, because that's only going to increase. Years ago, we would have said around 12% of students would have a declared disability, but the numbers are way higher now, particularly when you're talking about mental health conditions, and if you're talking about individuals with neurodiverse conditions, particularly if we're not going to have formal diagnoses, because we know that they can take years to get, and we should be responding to that. The number of students that are going to need individual needs is going to only increase.
And some of these problems caused by the approach that's taken with the examination, the format of the assessment. You know, could it be? So I've heard stories within the higher education space of more choice being given and provided to students as to how they want to be assessed. So going from, write an essay to give a presentation. Is the style of assessment sometimes a factor in the welfare kind of cases, or is it something else? Is it just it doesn't matter how you're assessed, it would still be an issue?
I think we could probably talk for ages on this, but if I try and talk very quickly. So basically, if you think that you've got a learning outcome, so at the end of the day, the student has to meet a learning outcome.
Yep. So
whether that is to demonstrate their knowledge in something, or whether it is to be able to provide a convincing argument on something. The Aberhart case was based on the fact that for the learning outcome for that, or for the requirement to prove a learning outcome in that particular case, was they said it had to be a live presentation.
Right.
And the case law says, actually, even if it had to be a live presentation, which they weren't convinced it had to be, you could do a live presentation by recording something.
Yeah.
Or you could do a live presentation in a room to the tutor. You didn't have to do it in front of however many in the cohort.
Yeah.
So what universities are trying to do is try and peel this back now. In universities, generally speaking, where you offer an element of choice, it creates so much complexity that it's really hard to track what's going on. It's not very clear on the student. But if you think of a learning outcome that needs to be met, and if you've got somebody who you know has got a specific need, one of the things we created at Brunel was we tried to create effectively a matrix to say that if this is the learning outcome, here's a variety of assessments that you could use. So you might use this particular assessment as your standard one, but if you've got somebody who can't meet that, or it creates so much anxiety or stress that it exacerbates their condition, then the thought has already happened into what the alternative assessments could be. Because I think often we assume that our academic colleagues would just know what other form of assessment to do, but maybe that's not, maybe they don't know, or maybe they have never had to think about it before, or maybe they've never mapped it against a learning outcome. It might also be true, depending on how the curriculum is put together, that learning outcome may have been demonstrated in another module somewhere else, and therefore actually across their whole learning they have met it. So they don't necessarily need to be forced to do a particular assessment. But then you're on to specific case-by-case consideration, depending on what course somebody's done, what module options they may have taken. So it can be quite complicated. But the work that had been done that I was involved with previously was trying to have some of that forward thinking done already, and trying to, in that example I just said about the presentation, had somebody considered, instead of a presentation, they could just create a video, for example.
And so as we kind of wrap up, I suppose, how do you see the kind of assessment trends and the welfare trends, and I suppose the integrity trends, we kind of touched on them a little bit, and the technology trends, as they all kind of intersect, and life continues on and assessment is part of it. How do you see that developing? What would be your kind of prediction for how assessment might look in a university? I know it's a big question, but
it is a big question, and I'm wondering what I think might happen. What I would like to happen might not also be the same. I think.
Okay, what you'd like to happen? Go tell me that one first.
What I would like to happen is for there to be a way that we could do smarter integration. That, what I just said, a learning outcome may have been met in a different module. I would love for there to be assessment across a program, not necessarily across per module, so that actually it's a bit smarter and that you can link things together in a way. But it's tricky because students choose which modules that they want to do. So the matrix to do that would be complicated. But I think that is how students could join their learning together a little bit more and understand the interdependencies between things that they're learning. Working in universities, what I hear a lot is that there's a feeling that there is over-assessment of students. So there's a desire to assess less, but that contradicts with authentic assessment, which would mean more smaller, frequent assessment to understand and to have more of an engagement conversation with students throughout their assessment, rather than here's all your learning and you do it at the end. I suspect probably what will happen is a combination of all of those things, depending on which way an institution feels it wants to go, or which way a subject feels they want to go. I mean, what is better? Is it better to have one big assessment at the end, or lots of little touch points so that you're on track in the right direction? What would your preference be?
Well, I tell you what, so what we'll touch on it very briefly, but we were both at university together, weren't we? Which is where we first met. And I think we both had very different experiences with examinations and assessment. Your course, I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, was more of a summative based experience, probably had formative exercises during the process. Whereas mine was very much a formative, ongoing, project-based piece of work. And I don't think I could have done any other course where I could have done a course where it was one big summative at the end, because I only had one final examination on my course, and I failed that one. And my A levels are terrible getting in. I only just kind of scraped to get in, but I just couldn't have got through that course with just with that final summative. I don't perform very well on final summative tasks. So my preference is more authentic kind of regular, ongoing, drip fed. And I honestly think that that's better for the integrity of assessment as well, because if you're leaving things more towards the end, unless you're doing it on campus, if you're doing things remotely and stuff, there is more chance of some breaches to the integrity process. I think you need to be careful on detection along there, because if you're giving them essays to do all the time, like you mentioned GPT and stuff like that, then who is actually writing that content? So my preference is regular ongoing. It sounds like your preference is more that way. Was that right about your kind of assessment experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I was always end of module exams. They were hour-and-a-half exams, and they were just terrifying. Hated them. I think I've probably changed over the years in my preferred way of learning, and the reflection of maybe my preferred subject of learning. Dare I say that? So, as you know, I did maths as an undergraduate, and I can't imagine how I would do such a thing now. Whereas now I'm doing further study, I'm doing my doctorate in social sciences, and it's much more, word-based writing. And in fact, I was on a session just on the weekend, and they're trying to encourage free writing, and you do free writing every day, and just getting whatever you want out so that you can then build up on it over time. So I think now I would prefer the little and often. And particularly for a little bit of that feedback. I think our students want and expect feedback constantly now. And if you don't do anything till the end, how do you give that to them?
I know, exactly. And that's one of the problems with summative, especially is you don't get any feedback on the examination. Well, it's rare that you get feedback on a summative examination. It might be slightly different now in the university, but certainly if you take an examination, you do GCSEs or something like that, you don't get feedback on how you performed. Because it kind of doesn't matter in a way, because your feedback is a grade, but it doesn't help you going forward. And I suppose this is my issue with summative in some ways, is that particularly GCSEs, I'm a kind of big believer that we should scrap GCSEs and move to more of a diagnostic process, because you stay on education. Gone are the days where you left at 16. It's better that you've got more of a map, more of a guide to your future studies. So, delivering a diagnostic style assessment or something at the end of that process, so it aids you in your next journey, is much better than saying, a third of the students are failures because they didn't, achieve a pass mark and things like that. But I suppose feedback, but the feedback burden for professors, is going to only increase there, isn't it? Teachers, if there is that constant feedback, AI might be able to help with that, though, mightn't it? So.
Well, this is where you end up with these conflicting ideas the whole time. And we want to do less assessment to free up time for professors, but if you do more regular, authentic assessment, that actually increases the burden. So, kind of what is the right thing to do? And probably the answer is it depends what the subject the student is studying, because actually that should probably guide what is done, and probably actually is what's happening now is the subject guides largely.
Yeah, it's interesting to. Actually, I one passing thought really, as I've been kind of thinking more about higher education, is that what would be nice is if universities didn't look solely at their own campus and their institution as to how they do things, and let's say maths or something like that, look at it joining up and connecting up more with other universities on that particular subject. Because I think in pre-chat we talked about the fact that there was a couple of departments that weren't using the main centralized exam platform that you used because it wasn't suitable for their subject. I suppose, like last question, I suppose, is are you seeing universities working closer together in that kind of way, or is it still very much an institution ring-fenced activity?
So I think as a sector, the higher education sector is really sharing. So although it is meant to be marketized, it's always amazing to me how open people are and they're prepared to share, and there is collaboration across universities. But ultimately, each university is responsible for their own curriculum, their own assessment, their own marking. So that kind of cross-sharing might not work in that way. It definitely works in the research space. Definitely, there's loads of collaboration and sharing in the professional services arenas. And they probably are subject-based, but the end of the day, it's each university to define their own curriculum. So I think they're probably a little bit limited on what they can do too much in sharing assessments.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's just a thought. Anyway, right. Well, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. And well, I'll put your LinkedIn address into the show notes so everyone can see and find you and connect with you. And I'm sure if anyone's got any kind of questions about registrar or indeed are looking to kind of contract with you in the future, I'm sure you'd be more than happy to have that conversation, wouldn't you, Lesley?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. And I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lesley. That was excellent. Yes, so as you kind of we kind of hinted at, Lesley and I have been friends for many years since our university days, and we've taken some quite different paths in our career. But it was great to hear Lesley's perspective on the registrar role, the examinations role, and then more important, that student welfare side of things, just how that has evolved and how much more in tune we are with, I suppose, the feelings and emotions that people have in the examination process. You know, I hope that will continue, and that people will be much more aware of that. Those the trauma, I suppose, that some people face with their examinations, and I think we do need to wake up to that a little bit more. Anyway, that's it from me for this week. So this is episode 1 in the mini-series. We'll have 2 more coming up, as I mentioned earlier. But in the meantime, great seeing you, and we'll see you next week for more. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.